So we're ready to install our Zappi 2 EV charging unit, and that's what we're going to talk you through in this video, the installation process. We've got our Zappi 2 charger in the box here ready to go, and the first thing we're going to do is open the box up, have a look at what you'll find inside here, and talk you through some of the key features of the equipment enclosed in the box to help your installation journey be a nice smooth one. So let's get the box opened and have a look at what's in here.
So we'll open the cardboard box and to reveal some paperwork first of all then, Joe. So what have we got here with the first piece?
We've got the customer service letter, so that must be left with the customer, and there you'll find all the contact information that will be helpful to the customer and also to the installer if you've got any questions about that specific install.
Okay, the next one is an installation quick guide. What's that?
So again, this contains key information about the installation process, and that's going to be helpful if you've done perhaps a number of Zappi 2 installations over the course of a few months, and it just contains the key features that perhaps you'll need to refer back to.
Okay, and then one book that's considerably thicker.
In here we've got the main operation and installation manual. So again, there's much more detailed information in here, perhaps about specialist submenus that you might need for particular installations, but also key information for the consumer, for the customer, in order to be able to operate their Zappi 2 charger effectively. So again, that's useful to be left with the customer.
So keep that one safe.
Absolutely.
So next down we've got the template. Okay, we've got a number of holes in the template. Joe, so you can just talk me through what the holes are for?
Yep, so here we've got our different fixing options for the Zappi 2 charging unit, depending on what surface you're fixing to.
Okay.
So if you're fixing to a brick wall, you can see here we've got this hole, and this hole would be used. If perhaps you're fixing this internally, maybe to a stud wall, if you're in a garage or something like that, then we would use this hole, and this hole.
Okay. Also indicated on either side and at the bottom are the positions in which we can enter via a gland, as well as a hole here, Joe. What's this hole for?
So again, that's another option for rear entry into the Zappi 2 charging unit if you want to bring your cable in that way. And that's actually the way we're going to install our Zappi 2 charger in this instance, so that will become particularly relevant as the video progresses.
Okay, let's move that to one side. Just push that there.
Very nice.
So next we're looking at the actual cover. So these come in two colours. The customer chose this time to have a white one. We've got a white garage door. We've got white UPVC windows. What other colours does it come in?
That's also available in black, and you'll pick the one you want to match the decor of the building that you're installing it in.
Okay, so just so I pop that just there.
Excellent.
Okay, so under here we've now got a couple of symbols you'll be very careful to look at. We've got one here that suggests that the CT is below here, and this one here is the fixings, which is actually within the actual cardboard section here. So in order to get those out, so we'll lift this up, we've actually got the fixings within there, so we'll reveal those. And inside there we have our plastic plugs, our screws, and our very important washers in order to maintain the IP rating, something that we'll go through in detail when we actually secure it to the wall.
Yep, and of course those fixings have actually been designed to be used in conjunction with the Zappi 2 charging unit, so you need to use those fixings in order to install your Zappi 2 charging unit to whatever surface you're mounting on, including the plugs, including the screws, and including the washers.
Okay, and the CT is under, so it's not in that section, so we lift this section and we'll move it out of the way. Our CT is in here, so in this little box here we have our CT. So as we open that up, we've got a pre-wired CT for our installations for that. So that was actually in the box under there, Joe. So if we put that one back on the side there.
Absolutely. And then finally, we've got our Zappi 2 charging unit itself.
So lift that one out.
Now, one of the things you'll notice is that there's a number of screws around the outside here, and it's very important to make sure that when you install this, you do those screws up to the correct torque value. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later in the video. What else can we see on this, Gary, as we spin it around a little bit?
We've got the side here, the section that was shown on the cardboard template. That's a section that can be glanded into. We've got one on the bottom, and again, one on the side. And you talked about the ability to come in, and that's the hole that was on the cardboard template in order that you could do a rear entry.
Absolutely. We've also got this groove down the back here where you can run your cable down should you want to move this up and down the wall a little bit after you've brought your cable out. So we'll pop this on the wall down here along with the rest of the equipment, and what you can see neatly laid out there is all of the equipment, all of the paperwork, and all the different things that you'll find inside your Zappi 2 charging unit box. So just to recap, we've got our paperwork including our customer service letter, our quick install guide, and our operation installation manual. We've got the template in order to help us fix that to the wall. We've got our fixings, which must be used in conjunction with the Zappi 2 charging unit in order to maintain the IP rating and the integrity of the box. And we've also got our CT, our cover for the Zappi unit, and also the actual Zappi unit itself.
So at the stage now, we've got our CT cable coming through. We've got our 6mm squared cable as well, Joe. It's time to fit our Zappi 2 EV charging point to the fabric of the building.
Absolutely.
Any other considerations we're going to need?
Well, we've got to think about the mounting height, Gary. We may well have a customer who perhaps wants it up at head height, or we might have someone who wants it down at low level. But we've got to make sure that whatever height we mount it at, we comply with all the relevant regulations. Now that includes BS 7671 section 722, which offers some guidance on mounting heights.
It does.
But also we want to think about complying with Part M of the building regs where required. Now it might seem like there's a bit of a conflict between those two sets of regulations. So what height are we going to mount this at, Gary?
We're going to be between 0.75 of a metre and 1.2 metre for the actual socket itself or any switching mechanism that it would have. This one hasn't got one, so we've got the socket itself. It's got to fall within those measurements.
Yeah, and if you mount it at that height, then you actually comply with all the requirements of all the regulations. So you're kind of in the sweet spot where all of those regulations are met.
And which guidance are we actually following to get those heights, Joe?
So we're following the IET Code of Practice for Electric Vehicle Charging, which is really the best practice for electric vehicle charging installations.
And always suggest that you check what the latest practice is at the point of which you're watching this part of the video presentation.
Because times change.
We're going to fit this to the wall. There's some other considerations, especially around IP ratings that we've got to look at. But I think first of all, maybe we use the template and get our fixing holes ready before we consider the IP rating of the actual enclosure.
Let's do that next.
So we've got the template that's been provided. There's several holes in here which we can choose from. Joe, can you explain which ones you're going to use?
Yeah, we've got this excellent little imaging system here that helps us to understand which ones to use. You can see here we've got a combination of brick and stud. Here we've got just brick and here we've got just stud, and that indicates which holes we're going to use. We're going into brick, so therefore we're going to use this one because it has a brick pattern on there, and we're going to use this brick pattern, so this hole and this hole. So those are the ones that we're going to drill through. If we were just drilling into stud, then we would use that one, and that one to give us a nice firm fixing. The other thing we just need to think about is here you can see there is a little punched out hole here that we can just remove that from, and that gives us space to bring the cable through so we can get this flat against the wall and get it marked out ready for drilling. So you can see we've just knocked out the hole here where we've got the bit of cardboard so that we could put that over the cables. We've got this set to the right height now, and we've got this nice and level so we can mark the holes and get it drilled at this point. So we'll do that now. So we'll get that marked up, get a hole marked up down here and one down here, and then it's just a matter of removing the template, drilling the holes, and we're good to go. Now, just before we start drilling any holes in the wall, it's important to reiterate that we should be using the fixings as provided with your Zappi 2 charger. So we've got here a brown wall plug, and we've also got a round head screw, so make sure that you use those. And because we're using a brown wall plug, we'll be using a 7mm diameter or 6.5mm diameter masonry bit to drill those holes. So now we've got our holes drilled and the fixings in place, it's time to remove the lid from the Zappi 2 and have a look at what's going on inside here, because there's a couple of really key points that we just need to think about before we actually put this onto the wall. So with screws undone, it's very, very easy just to get the front off here. That lifts off like that. Now you'll notice when you open this up that there are a couple of connections going from the back of the unit to the front. You've got plenty of slack on these mains cables that connect the socket up on the front there. But what we do want to be very careful about is this ribbon cable. In fact, at this point here, what we want to do is disconnect that cable from the front panel so that we avoid causing any damage during installation to the delicate pins that sit on there. Now the next thing we're going to do is start fixing this onto the wall. So before we do that, we just want to think about the fixing holes that are pre-drilled into the back of the Zappi 2 unit. So you'll notice that when you open this up that all the fixing holes in the back have these little rubber bungs that are put in place there to maintain the IP rating of the charging unit, and that's a really important point at this stage. When we start installing the Zappi 2 charging unit, we want to make sure that we never compromise the IP rating of this unit, because if moisture starts getting inside here, that could start to cause problems with the electronics that are inside it. So whichever holes you're using to fix, and we're using the one at the top, so we'll have that one out of there. We've got the one just there, and then we've got another one just here. those are the fixing holes we're going to use. So you can see we want to leave the rubber bungs in the relevant holes for the holes that we are not using. So we're not using these fixing holes, so they want to stay in place. If during transit they've worked their way loose, make sure you find them and make sure that you stick them into the holes that you're not using. That's really important. And if it was me, I was installing a few of these, I'd hang on to these little rubber bungs, put them in the toolbox, so that in the future I've always got spares in case some of them go walkabout. So, having mentioned how important it is to make sure that you've got these bungs in place to maintain the IP rating of the fitting, you might be looking at these holes and thinking, well, surely moisture is going to seep in through those when we put our screws in. So, in order to overcome that, the Zappi 2 comes with these little washers here. Now these are very clever because they've got the normal metallic part of a washer there, but then on the underside they've got this rubber seal as well. So it's important that when we start fixing these, we use the fixings that Myenergi provide in the Zappi 2, and we make sure that those washers are put in place so that when we screw this onto the wall, it creates a waterproof seal around that fixing hole. So having spoken about the fixings on the Zappi 2 charging unit, we now want to start thinking about cable entry. So we want to start thinking about how we're going to bring the cable in. One of the really clever design features of the Zappi 2 is this groove that allows you to run your cable down the back of the fitting. So if you drill a hole through the wall and then decide you need to move your charging unit up or down a little bit, this is designed to accommodate the cable being laid flat on the wall. You'll notice this large flat section here, and again that is designed to be drilled through and bring the cable in. Now what we don't recommend is that you ever think about using perhaps silicone or sealant in order to maintain the IP rating of the fitting. That's not really the best way of doing it. The best way of doing it is to use a stuffing gland, and the stuffing gland that we're going to use here has the correct profile on the insert here to accommodate our 6mm cable, and we're going to install that onto this flat section here. Now you might be looking at this and thinking, well, if I put a stuffing gland onto that flat section, I'm going to have to dig a big hole out of the brickwork where I've installed this in order to bring the cable through and accommodate the stuffing gland. Well, again, this is where we can show some really clever lateral thinking. If you put the stuffing gland on the inside of the fitting with the nut on the outside, then what that means is that actually you can tighten this gland up onto the cable once it's been installed and is in situ, and it means that you don't have the bulk of that sitting on the outside of the charging unit. It'll still maintain the IP rating, but just a word of warning, make sure that you've got your little black seal there in place, because that's going to be critical in making sure that the IP rating is what it should be. So that's going to sit on there. Now again, you might be thinking, well, I could just about squeeze my CT cable through there as well. Don't do that, because that's not going to maintain the IP rating of the fitting if you try and do that, and moisture could leak in through there. If you look again at the bottom here, we've got this nice flat section on the base, and we've got this overhanging lip here. So what we're recommending is, again, put your stuffing gland on the inside of the fitting, down at the bottom there. Bring your CT cable through the bottom, make sure you've got your nut and your washer on there as well. And then what that allows you to do is it allows you to tighten up the gland onto the CT cable on the inside of the fitting, and you don't have the cable hanging down underneath or the stuffing gland sticking out, and that really is just an aesthetic thing. That's going to make it look really nice and neat. Obviously, if you want to have that on the outside and the customer doesn't have a problem with that, absolutely fine, but that's sort of what we're aiming for. So now we know how to maintain the IP rating when it comes to installing the fixings and when it comes to installing the cable entry and the way that we're going to maintain the integrity of the IP rating inside our Zappi 2 charger. It's time to get it on the wall and get the cables installed. So now we've got all the holes installed into our Zappi 2 charging unit that we need, we're going to fit our stuffing glands in here. So bearing in mind that clever lateral thinking, let's think about putting the stuffing gland on the inside so that we can maintain the IP rating of the fitting. So we put the stuffing gland on the inside, the lock nut just simply screws onto the outside, and you can see there that we're going to be able to get our cable into that absolutely no problem. So we'll nip that up with a spanner in a moment, and then we want to think about installing our stuffing gland for the CT cable. So we're going to put that in the bottom here. So again, if we just undo the nut from off of that and pop that through the hole. Now again, the reason that we're doing this on the inside is just purely for aesthetics really, so that you don't have the stuffing gland sticking out the bottom, and the cable will also take a more discreet route into the fitting. So there you see, mains cable coming through there, CT cable coming through there. We're ready to start thinking about connecting. So we're in a position now where we can put the Zappi charger onto the wall and fix it back, but we've got that all important point to think about, where we've got to make sure that we are using the correct washers that are provided. We don't want to fall into the trap of replacing these with penny washers and thinking that that's going to be okay. We want to make sure that we install the correct washers onto the fitting. So we'll get this on the wall now. So we're ready to get this installed on the wall now. So it's just very simply a matter of threading the 6mm cable through the gland that we've got in place there, and then that's just going to slip back beautifully. Just make sure that we keep the CT cable running down through the groove at the back so that that doesn't get crushed, and that's all nicely lined up. Now at this point, again, we just want to make this absolutely critical point that we don't want to be chucking these washers away. We want to make sure that we're using these. Don't be tempted to replace them with penny washers, as these maintain the IP rating of the box. So we want to make sure that those are used and in place with the rubber seal against the plastic surface of the charging unit. So we'll get this screwed onto the wall. Screwed on there, and then we'll put our second one in down behind these cables. So I'm just going to be careful that I don't nick these while I'm screwing this up. There we go. There we go, and then the final one in the top, and that is this screwed onto the wall with all of our screws in place. And we can start wiring up. So now we'll get our CT cable pushed up into our stuffing gland and bring that up there, and that's going to come over to this side, so we can see there that that's nicely in place, and then it's just a matter of tightening up the stuffing glands and we can connect this up. So now we're in a position to make the connections with our conductors that we've installed here. So you can see we've got this block here is our incoming supply. So we've got L1, neutral, and the CPC connection there. You may also notice there's a gap here where we've got L2 and L3. And if this was a 3-phase charging unit, then that's where we'd make the connection for our other line conductors. But as it's single phase, we've just got those 3 connections there. Over on this side of the Zappi charging unit, we've got our CT connections. You can see the space there to connect up 3 current transformers for measuring various currents, and we'll talk a little bit more about what they can be used for. But in this case, we're just going to show the connections being made. So a really important point that we need to make at this stage is that when we connect our conductors into this terminal, we need to make sure that we get the correct torque setting. So each of these 3 terminals will need to be set to 1.2 Newton meters. So we're going to use our torque screwdriver to achieve the correct torque settings. The reason that this is important is fairly obvious. If we over tighten these connections, we could damage the connection onto the printed circuit board, and if we don't do them up tight enough, then obviously we're going to run into all the common problems that we have with loose connections. So we'll set these to the correct torque settings. So we'll get this up to 1.2, so we've got that in there, and just give that a little twist, and that'll click off at 1.2 Newton meters. That one as well, get that to 1.2. There we go. And now the CPC connection, we'll get that up to 1.2 as well. There we go. So those are now done to the correct values. So depending on the configuration of our installation, we may have up to 3 current transformers connected into our Zappi 2 unit. Now you can see these terminals are quite small down here, so to make life easier, we can just pull that out from there make our connections with our wires into the bottom of that little plug and socket arrangement, and then connect that back up inside. It's very, very important that if you've got just one current transformer, if you've got multiple ones, that you make a note of where you've got your current transformers connected. So here we've connected into CT1, and that can be quite important when we start looking at the commissioning of our Zappi 2 unit. At this stage, while we're talking about the current transformer connection, it's worth stating that you may find that the cable provided with the current transformer isn't long enough to get from the mains end to your Zappi 2 charger. Now, if that's the case, the recommendation is that you use a Cat5 cable to extend that, and when you make the connection to extend it, it's not recommended that you use the lever type connectors, as this can raise one or two issues. It's best to use a screwed or crimped connection. So now we've made all the connections inside our Zappi 2 charging unit, what we can now do is put the cover back on. A couple of points just to think about as we're doing this. The first one is we make sure that the RCD board, as you can see here, is firmly connected into the back PCB board. Now, don't be tempted to remove this or pull at it, but just make sure, just give it a little push, top and bottom, just to make sure that that is firmly seated home. And if it is, we're ready to move on to start thinking about connecting the front back up again. And what we want to make sure of also is that this ribbon cable that we disconnected earlier is now firmly seated back onto the back connection. So make sure that's pushed in there nice and firmly. We need to reconnect this ribbon cable that allows the screen to talk to the equipment in the back of the charging unit. And as we put this back on, we want to make sure that the O-ring that goes around here, this seal, is in place. And then we want to make sure that as we screw this back, we set the front screws here to the correct torque setting as well. And as it happens, it's the same torque setting that we apply to the screws inside the connections. So we're going to set this to 1.2 Newton meters as we were before, and then just screw these up until we hear that clicking noise. And that's all about maintaining the IP rating of the installation. There we go. Now we've got the lid on, it's time to just install the faceplate just to finish the nice aesthetic look of this. So there's a little lip on the top here that just inserts into a slot, so just push that in there, and then it's just a matter of clipping it on at the bottom. And there's our Zappi 2 charging unit installed. I'm sure you'll agree it makes a beautiful addition to the front of the house. It matches the white garage door beautifully. This is available in black also, and I think you'll agree that that is a very fine looking piece of equipment that you've chosen to install. Okay then, so let's just summarise our Zappi installation training video. At the start of the video we saw the different variants that were available, what you'll see when you open the box when your Zappi 2 is delivered. We saw there you could have the white or black trim, tethered or untethered, and also single and three-phase variants are available. We then emphasised the point all the way through the video about IP ratings and making sure that you maintain the integrity of the enclosure in terms of ingress protection. So that means using stuffing glands with seals and using separate ones for both the mains cable and the CT cable, making sure that all of the bungs are in the holes that you don't use for fixing, and when fixing that the relevant washers are used as provided by Myenergi. Also making sure that the front cover screws are set to the correct torque to make sure that the seal is maintained on the front of the Zappi 2 charging unit. We also spoke about extending the CT cable using a Cat5 type cable and screwed connections rather than the lever type maintenance-free connections. Mounting heights were also discussed, making sure that we meet all the relevant regulations as required under the UK regs. We also spoke about the correct use of the template, making sure that we set it to the right position and we use the right fixing holes. And a couple of critical points as well. Remember to remove the ribbon cable when you remove the front of the Zappi 2 charging unit, and also, equally important, remember to reconnect it just before you screw the front cover back on again. And then finally, make sure that the conductors on the mains cables are done up to the correct torque setting. All that remains of this video is to say, thank you very much for watching.